Hello. Are human rights even relevant today? Are you cynical? I teach human rights and I'm cynical. But I'd like to propose that we have a right to be cynical, but that the failure is not necessarily human rights. Human rights has been co-opted, and probably the failure is our own failure for not manifesting human rights more in our everyday lives. I want to explore that topic with you. My name is Vahan Bournazian. I was born and raised in the United States. I have the education of a lawyer. I practiced immigration law in the United States before I came to Armenia to teach law. And since 2011, I've taught human rights as well. So in exploring the issue with you, we have to explore how human rights can be made cynical and co-opted. And I think that we should look at, number one, the fact that human rights is expressed through law or rules. And number two, that states are actually co-opted or not fully authentic in many ways in terms of how they conduct themselves. And it's related to a lack of democracy. And I also think we have to review what we conceive of as civil society, because we have this problem where civil society can also be co-opted. In looking first at law, why are we cynical? Well, we have to understand that law keeps track of the violations. So when we see a human rights violation, we see that that violation was committed. We don't see how many times the rule was obeyed. And this is just a general problem with law itself. Law is always after the fact. So when we have a rule prohibiting murder, and we've prohibited murder for centuries, and yet murder still occur. So does that mean that the rule doesn't work? No, because we don't know how many murders were prevented because there is a rule prohibiting murders. Now, how can we prohibit more murders? Well, if there's enforcement. So enforcement leads to deterrence. It means that people change their conduct when they don't want to face the consequence. So the problem that we've seen recently in the current conflict is that Azerbaijan was the aggressor state. There's many human rights legal experts that have already declared that Aliyev should be tried for the crime of aggression, but we see no consequence. So that is a problem with the politicalization of the human rights framework. If we see that there's international experts that condemn Azerbaijan's actions as illegal, and yet the Security Council does not act because it is a political organ and it is politicized, and there are certain countries that have vetoes. So we see that there's a failure in the framework. It's not that human rights are wrong, it's that there's a place where enforcement is lacking, and so there's no consequence for the perpetrator. And we see this also in the regional framework with the fact that as soon as the conflict started, Armenia applied to the European Court of Human Rights for intermediate measures. These were granted, and yet there was no consequence. This is because the European Court of Human Rights and all of its judgments can only be enforced through the Council of Ministers, and that's again a political organization. So we have set up a legal framework for human rights that only goes halfway. We need to not abandon human rights, but we need to correct the failures in the process of securing legal human rights as law or rules. The other issue that we have is rules are obeyed when there's reciprocity. Rules are obeyed when we know the value behind the rule. I don't commit murder because I don't want to be subject to the crime of murder. I don't use violence in my interaction with others because I don't want others to use violence in their interaction with me. Rules principally work on reciprocity. So that works when both parties understand the underlying value of the rule, and when both parties are interested in that underlying value. So that basically works when, in the international realm, when we have governments that are truly representative of their populations. If the Azeri regime, which has never had a valid election and is known to oppress all of any opposition voice, is not interested in human rights and democracy, and not interested in the benefit that those systems render to the population. If the Azeri regime is willing to abuse its own people, then it's fine with its people being subjected to danger, threat. It's not interested in reciprocity. So reciprocity can be undermined when there's no democracy. This is very well researched by Amartya Sen, an academic, and in his book Development as Freedom, he goes through examples of how political regimes or governments that are democratic are forced to be concerned for their populations, and those that are not are willing to sacrifice people for power and for their own interests. So we have this problem with politicalization, and we also have this problem with incomplete legal framework. And we also have the problem that we've left all of this to diplomats and to international affairs. So what we see is that we don't have the failure of human rights so much as we have the failure, or actually the co-opting of human rights by diplomats. Look, if the rules worked and everyone obeyed the rules, we wouldn't need diplomats. So there's actually a conflict of interest. Diplomats actually have more power when there's chaos. Diplomats have more authority and that whole realm of international affairs rules when there's no law. So that conflict of interest needs to be approached. The other problem that we have and why we become cynical about human rights is that we see that states are supposed to carry out functions which they don't do. The state is supposed to be a cooperative mechanism. It's supposed to be what safeguards the population and provides services to the population. And we participate in the state in order to have those benefits. And so what we see is that when the state is compromised, the framework is undermined. So states are compromised in many different ways, but one way is by debt. So a simple example is Guatemala was so in debt to the World Bank that the World Bank would dictate to Guatemala its budget. So even though the Guatemalan Constitution secured free public education, the Guatemalan government did not comply with its own constitution because the World Bank said, no, you won't, because you need to pay back your debt. I mean, this is an extreme example, but we see this all the time, that debt is used to control. And another good resource to understand this is John Perkins. If you look at his book, The Confessions of an Economic Hitman, or watch his videos online, he explains the system of debt, which is used to compromise states. We have the same example in Armenia when, in 2011, Russia raised the price of natural gas. But the Republican regime secretly took out a loan to subsidize that increase in price so that people would not pay a higher natural gas price because there were elections in 2012 and 2013. And then after that, it was admitted that the Armenian state gave up its interest in Gazprom because it couldn't pay back that debt. And all of that was done in secret. So debt is a very common way. Notice that one state forced the debt and the other state participated in that because It was a regime that was not truly elected and was not truly serving the interests of the population, but rather the interests of the oligarchs. Another good resource to look at how states are compromised, especially in a post-Soviet state, is Jess Driscoll, which he wrote a book called Warlords and Political Coalitions in Post-Soviet States. And he explains that basically you have certain strongmen emerge when the Soviet Union dissolved. Certain strongmen emerged that they controlled certain regions, economically, etc., politically, and that they coalesced together in order to pretend to be a state, in order to get international aid. And we see the international aid come in, it goes into the state budget, and then it gets used to pay for the services that the oligarchs are providing. So the oligarchs pay themselves through the state budget from the international aid. So there's many ways in which states are compromised. So in order to rectify that, we need to have stronger democracy. We need to pursue stronger democracy through transparency, participation, and accountability. The other thing I just want to mention before we run out of time for this session is that we have a problem with civil society sector being co-opted. And it's because there's a focus on money and management. If we look how civil society is organized, often civil society organizations are managed as if it were business. There's a business management premise. All management is based on business management. And we have this interesting issue between this dynamic between donors and civil society organizations, NGOs, and grants. And what happens is that because the state is compromised and the state is not providing for the people, we have NGOs become service providers. And then when the NGO becomes a service provider, it doesn't seek to help the individual become self-sufficient. It creates this clientelism. So NGOs participate in getting grants in order to provide services. Not that this is wrong, but it needs to go further than that because we need to make the step to make people self-sufficient, not just having them as clients. I mean, a very recent simple example is with the issue with refugees. Let's talk about like the organic response and the inorganic response, where you had refugees from Artsakh and you had people volunteering their homes. You had people willing to receive others unknown. That's the organic civil society. It didn't need any institution or any organization. And then you have the organizations where they were giving products to refugees, not money. And this idea was that, a friend of mine who worked with refugees said these people have never had so many beauty products. They've never had so much shampoo in their lives. Because the organizations were providing products which they purchase from businesses, which finances the businesses, instead of giving these people just financial aid. And it was under this idea of, we don't want to give money because we don't know what they will do with it. But you have to understand the context. These are refugees. They're not people that have never managed their own finances. They're not people that are coming to assistance because they have a drug addiction or some kind of dependency. There's no evidence that they're going to misuse funds, so why don't we just give them funds? So the question is, donors often apply some universal program that doesn't necessarily correspond with the context and the reality on the ground. And this is an example of top-down management, where donors dictate to organizations how they should provide relief. And organizations accept these premises and then follow these guidelines. And it happens in research too, where I just have an example, many examples, but there was a program to do research, and it had multiple goals. They also wanted to introduce the concept of town hall meetings. So they wanted people in rural villages in Armenia to come to meet in public and discuss the human rights issue. And so these people would learn the concept of town hall, as if Armenians in villages don't talk to each other, as if they don't already organize their lives cooperatively with each other. But the crazy thing is the topic was sexual reproduction. It's just such a contradiction that you're going to have people come and discuss publicly something of such personal nature. So we have this concept of pursuing these multiple agendas, and with the top-down attitude, with the international expert dictating, with the donor dictating, and organizations dictating, then we have problems with authenticity. How do we solve this? Well, for the NGOs, we have to look at participatory action research. We have to make people move from victims to participants. So that is with service provision. Make people participate so that they can solve their own problems. Have them participate in solving their own problems, not trying to solve the problem for them. And how do we collect people in groups so that they work together to solve problems collectively? And the same thing goes with the research. The person, you're interviewing the person because you want their story, because you need their story as a representative of victim. But no, you have to help them become an advocate for themselves so that they move from victim to participant. And they join with others who have the same problem, because isolation kills. With the states, we need people to be proactive, and we need to be proactive. We need to live human rights in order to correct these problems. I want to draw your attention to 2018 elections. Everyone said, oh, we couldn't have elections in April, right after the Velvet Revolution, because we needed to change the electoral code because it had been, all the prior elections were so bad. Well, guess what? We never changed the electoral code, and the situation changed, and we had to have elections, and we had the best elections we've ever had. And it was not based on law. Rules were immaterial. Rules didn't matter. What mattered was that people saw that they wanted to participate, and the whole attitude of people had changed. And people accepted their role as a participant and rejected being victims. And so the whole environment changed because people respected each other, respected each other's vote, respected the process, because they were invested in having a process. So we don't need rules in order to live human rights. And this happens on the international spectrum also, where we saw that with the landmine treaty to prohibit landmines, states that organized the convention for the treaty actually undermined the convention because states were making money and didn't want to participate, so they co-opted the process. So NGOs met on an international platform, organized the states that were willing to adopt the convention, held a new convention, got the convention adopted, and then forced the reluctant states to join that convention. Civil society can act locally and internationally in a genuine premise, and states will be forced to comply. The other thing about values and law, with the 2018 elections, that's a good example. It's a good example of people understanding value, understanding the reciprocity, willing to engage in reciprocity. And when we understand that I live a better life when my dignity is observed and protected, and that in order to do that, I need to do that for others. I want my vote to count. I have to respect the votes of others. And when we live this in our daily lives, then we also live this in another higher platform that we can talk about. So I think that we have to understand that there's two ways to be in the world: equal towards each other based on rights, understanding that value and being willing to participate in that system through reciprocity. Or the opposite is to be stuck in a hierarchy where we're constantly competing with each other for power. And no matter what hierarchy you're stuck in, there's someone standing on your shoulders, and you're not free. Even though there's reasons why we are cynical about human rights, We can change it when we decide to live human rights in our daily lives, in how we treat others, in how we organize organically to participate on all levels. I think we should think about that.